Hey everyone, welcome to Wealth Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Reynolds, certified financial planner and owner of Elevation Financial. I'm on the web at elevationfinancial.com. Thanks for joining me today. As always, glad you're here. Today we're talking about reasonable salary for S-Corps. What is a reasonable salary as owner of an S-Corp? And how can you minimize audit risk with the IRS? All right. So in general, whenever I talk about business topics, I always mention that owning a business has lots of challenges to navigate. We have a lot to worry about. Some of those things include things like taxes, entities, legal stuff. So business entity and taxation is one of those things we kind of wrestle with sometimes and have to think about. So many businesses that are small businesses choose to be taxed as an S corporation or S-Corp for short. An S-Corp has some advantages when it comes to taxation, which is why some people choose that tax status. So I'm going to start with a quick refresher so we can kind of frame the conversation with some proper definitions and background context. So refresher on what an S-Corp is. An S-Corp is not a legal entity. An S-Corp is a tax election. So an S-Corp is either an LLC or a C corporation that has elected to be taxed under S-Corp status. Most small businesses find it most advantageous to establish an LLC as a legal entity and then file for S-Corp status when appropriate. The reason is that a C Corp comes with lots of other overhead and administrative stuff you have to do and just kind of the cost to set up. So generally, for most small businesses, I recommend start as an LLC, and then when that makes sense, when the taxation lines up to do an S-Corp, go ahead and elect to be taxed as an S-Corp at that time. I see a lot of organizations, they start as a C-Corp entity and then elect S-Corp right away by default. And for some reason, they do that, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There are cases where a C-Corp does make sense. For example, if you expand or plan to expand and grow, take on investors, then a C-Corp might make sense. But for your average, especially solo small business, it really usually makes more sense to start as an LLC and then elect that S-Corp status when the time comes. So anyway, that's kind of a refresher on the context of what an S-Corp is. An S-Corp, again, is not a legal entity. It is a tax election. So if you're an S-Corp, you are either an LLC or a C-Corp that has elected to be taxed as an S-Corp. That doesn't really matter. I'm getting in the weeds, but it's just something to be aware of. So just like LLCs or other Schedule C entities like a sole proprietorship, S-Corps retain pass-through taxation. That means the income from the business passes through to the personal tax return of the owner, which is similar to the taxation of an LLC or a sole proprietor. So what's the advantage of an S-Corp? Why do people do it? Well, many business owners, they choose the S-Corp election because it can be more tax efficient than a Schedule C status. So in a Schedule C business, which again is an LLC or a sole proprietorship, all income is subject to self-employment taxes. Self-employment taxes are Social Security and Medicare taxes that self-employed individuals have to pay on their income. However, S-Corp shareholders who are also employees of the company can take a portion of their income as salary and the rest as a distribution. And the key here is that only the salary portion is subject to self-employment taxes while the distribution portion is not. So with this in mind, it's possible to reduce taxes by limiting the income paid through salary and maximize the amount paid through distributions to avoid those payroll taxes. So there's a catch, though. The catch is the IRS wants S-Corp owners to pay themselves a, quote, reasonable salary in the business. Otherwise, obviously, the owner could bypass 100% of self-employment taxes, which is obviously not in alignment with what the IRS wants. The IRS wants their taxes. So there's a limit to where they want to see that distribution percentage. So as an owner of an S-Corp, it's really important to determine a reasonable salary for yourself so you can avoid potential IRS audit risk. So the question is, how do you determine what is reasonable? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start by understanding the IRS penalties for paying an S-Corp salary that's too low. So if the IRS determines an S-Corp owner's salary does not meet the guidelines of reasonable salary, that S-Corp might be subject to penalties and fines. The IRS has the authority to reclassify distributions, for example, to owners as wages, which would increase, your payroll and tax liability. And some of the penalties and consequences of not paying a reasonable salary include additional taxes. Again, the IRS might reclassify those distributions to owners as wages. That would be back taxes to pay. Penalties. The IRS can also assess penalties for failure to pay employment taxes on reasonable compensation. These penalties can include failure to file and failure to pay penalties. You could lose the S-Corp status. One consequence could be if the IRS determines that the S-Corp has not paid reasonable compensation to the owner, they may revoke your S-Corp status. There's an audit risk. If the IRS determines the S-Corp has not paid reasonable compensation to the owner, it could trigger an audit of the company's payroll tax returns and other tax filings. So these are things you don't want to happen, obviously. Not great, right? So with penalties like these on the line, it's pretty clear that determining what's reasonable is something you want to be sure you get right as the owner of an S-Corp. So let's talk about guidelines for determining reasonable salary in an S-Corp. So first, it's important to understand that while the IRS does provide some guidance for determining a reasonable salary for S-Corp owners, it's not exact. It's a massive gray area with no definitive or specific answers. It is what it is. There's not a formula. There's not specific, clear precedent that you can just kind of call on and say, well, here's the exact formula to figure out the salary. It doesn't exist. The IRS does not give guidance that is that definitive. It's a large gray area and a spectrum on which you can fall. So that can be frustrating for business owners who want clear rules. It also opens the door for case-by-case interpretations and risk. So according to IRS guidelines, a reasonable salary is one that is comparable to what someone in a similar position would earn in a similar company. So factors are taken into consideration that include owner's experience, education, responsibilities, company size, industry, location. So these considerations can include things like, what do similar businesses pay for similar services? So if someone's going to hire someone to do your role in a similar business, what would that look like? What would the compensation be? What are the duties and responsibilities of the individual? What sort of training or experience is required for your role in the company? How much time and effort is devoted to the business? We'll talk about that briefly here in a few minutes. Is there a formalized compensation agreement? Is a reasonable formula in place to determine compensation? Is there some kind of justification for the compensation? How profitable is the business? And then what's the location? What area geographically is your business in? And does that play a part in determining compensation? For example, someone living in, San Diego would be in a different class of compensation as someone who's in Wichita, Kansas, for example. So keep that in mind. So, when determining a reasonable salary as an S-Corp owner, you want to consider various factors like the industry you operate in, experience, job duties. For example, if you're the CEO of a larger corporation, your salary is going to likely be higher than, a 2 or 3 person small business. If your job duties include managing a large team or overseeing complex projects, salary should reflect that responsibility. So as an owner, what are you doing in your company? What are you doing in your business? How large is your business? Where is it located? And so the time you spend in the business could also be a determining factor. If you work full time in the business, then your salary needs to reflect that. However, if you're less involved, let's say you only work a few hours a week in the business, you might be able to justify a lower salary. And this has happened. I've seen cases where it is justifiable and defensible, and tax experts have agreed that, let's say you work, 2 or 3 hours a week in the business, it's basically passive income. At that point, it's justifiable in many cases. Again, case by case, this is not specific advice, but it could be justifiable to take a lower salary because your involvement in the business is much lower. So here's a good rule of thumb. Rules of thumb, I think, are useful, and as long as you don't think of them as the end all be all. So a good rule of thumb is to use the question, if I were to fire myself today and hire a CEO to replace me, what would I pay that person? That would be a really good starting point to determine a reasonable guideline for what your salary might be. That can really help frame your compensation in a way that's logical and defensible. So there's some other tools you can use to determine reasonable salary. One tool is the database offered by the U.S. Department of Labor Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a mouthful. You can sort that data by occupation and location. And you can also use some other tools, including industry salary surveys. So there's lots of industry associations and organizations that conduct salary surveys, and they provide data on CEO salaries for businesses of different sizes and different regions, and they can help you with a baseline of what CEOs in similar industries and regions are earning. So whatever industry you're in, there's probably an association for it. Go to that association's website, log in if you're a member. There's probably data in there showing compensation numbers for owners or CEOs of businesses in your industry. That can help you get some good data. Also, look at job posting websites, sites like Glassdoor, Indeed. They can provide salary information for CEOs in certain businesses. Again, it's a general idea, it's ranges, and as always, no endorsement or affiliation is implied when I mention these sites, but they can be examples of sites you can use for getting data. You can also use a compensation consultant. If you're really serious about this and want to make sure you get it right and have a lot of questions or complexity in your situation, then you can hire a compensation consultant to do an audit of your business and give you more personalized feedback. Also, the SBA, Small Business Administration. There's usually an SBA office in every decent sized city near you. So you can go to the office and say, hey, look, I'm trying to figure out what my salary should be. Do you have any data that can help me? They probably do have data that can help you. And then finally, tax and accounting professionals, your CPA, your EA, your tax preparer. They can help you determine what a reasonable salary is based on their knowledge and experience in working with lots of small businesses. So talk to your CPA or EA if you want some personalized feedback as well. So, it's really important to consider multiple sources. Don't just kind of pick something out of the air. Look at some different data sources, get a good range of input to determine what a reasonable salary should be. It's also worth noting that certain fringe benefits can count toward reasonable compensation. So fringe benefits can include things like health, dental, and vision insurance premiums that are paid by the company, business-funded HSA contributions, disability insurance premiums. Those fringe benefits can count as compensation when you're gathering this data and putting that figure together. So let's talk about documentation briefly. So one of the best ways to minimize the risk of an IRS audit is to document your salary decisions and keep accurate records. So this includes keeping track of the factors you considered when determining your salary, such as things like industry standards, job duties, where you got the data. And you should also keep records of any research you conducted. Again, the salaries, consultations with experts. Keeping those detailed records will really help you demonstrate to the IRS that your salary is reasonable and potentially avoid audit issues. So everywhere you can document this is going to be useful. So, open up a document, a Google Doc or Word document, and just kind of, make a note of the process you went through to determine your salary. And then, for example, in your payroll system, go through, and every time you give yourself a raise or a change in compensation, make a note there. Hey, based on, cost of living raise, additional responsibilities, XYZ, just kind of treat yourself like any other employee and document your salary data and what the basis is for determining those numbers. So ultimately, you want to avoid paying yourself an unreasonably low salary. This can cause problems. It might be tempting to pay yourself a low salary to minimize those payroll taxes, but when you do that, you can increase your risk of an IRS audit, which that's no fun for anybody. So again, the IRS expects S-Corp owners to pay themselves a reasonable salary based on job duties and industry standards. So if you pay yourself an unreasonably low salary, the IRS may view this as an attempt to avoid payroll taxes, and that could trigger an audit. And again, say it again, keep in mind, as stated before, there's no concrete rules from the IRS on this topic. It's a big gray area. So therefore, a lot of it comes down to your appetite for risk as a business owner. So, on one hand, you can err on the side of caution and pay yourself a salary that is at the high end of reasonable in order to maximize your ability to defend your compensation in the event of IRS scrutiny. So this means you might pay more in taxes, but lowers your audit risk. You're being more conservative. On the other hand, you might favor minimizing taxes as the highest priority. So going this route, you would need to be willing to accept potentially increased audit risk that might result. You might end up spending more time and effort defending your compensation. In some cases, you might even have a higher risk of penalties or back taxes. So, you want to determine for yourself how aggressive or conservative you are in this area, because again, it's a big gray area. It comes down to what can you logically defend during an audit, what could trigger an audit. Could be the case by case situation, who's doing the audit. So again, you want to make sure that you understand where you are on that spectrum, how aggressive or conservative do you want to be, and how safe do you want to play it when determining your salary. So finally, S-Corp audit rates do remain pretty low. Reasonable compensation, however, is a common focus when it does happen. So while your chances of being audited in general as an S-Corp, not super high, at least during the time of this particular episode, but if you do get audited, it's fairly likely that your compensation is going to be a target for scrutiny. So just keep that in mind. And then it's always good to consult with a tax professional for guidance. So if you want some specific guidance, be sure you consult with your tax pro. Again, your CPA, your EA, your tax professional, tax attorney, perhaps, whoever helps you with taxes, talk to them as well. They can help you avoid these common mistakes by, giving you feedback, giving you ranges to think about when it comes to reasonable salary in your S-Corp, and help you minimize audit risk and make sure you're in compliance with those tax laws. So always a good idea to consult with a tax professional when this stuff comes up. All right. So that has been our discussion about what is a reasonable salary for an S-Corp owner. As always, there's always nuance after this. I try to make these pretty comprehensive, but if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. Always happy to just kind of talk over situations like this or anything else and give you feedback and answer any questions I can or point you in the right direction. All right. So with that, let's wrap it up, and I'll remind you where you can find me. I'm really easy to find. I'm on the web at elevationfinancial.com. I'm on all the social channels as well. Not all, but most. And so feel free to reach out. Again, elevationfinancial.com. You're welcome to just send me a note through my website or book a complimentary money session using that big friendly button on my homepage. And I'm happy to chat anytime. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.